Good evening and welcome. I'm Carla Sinopoli. I'm the director of the University of Michigan Museum Studies program, and I am delighted to welcome you to the second of 4 lectures we've organized this semester in a series called It's Alive, Rediscovering Institutions of Living Collections. This series, which is the brainchild of our associate director, Bradley Taylor, is based on the recognition that within the larger field of museum studies, museums of living collections seldom receive the same level of academic attention that collections of art and artifacts do. So zoos, botanical gardens, arboretums, aquariums, and anatomical collections are often seen as radically different than other museums, and they tend to be overlooked in discussions of issues relevant to all types of collecting institutions. Issues of ownership, voice, authority, ethics, authenticity, and display. And at the same time, because museums of living collections are so little understood by the greater museum studies community, we often fail to appreciate what is unique about their nature and the issues they deal with. So this fall, we're bringing together leaders and experts who work in and think about these kinds of institutions to help us explore them further and to foster a new appreciation of the diversity and complexity of the many kinds of museums and the challenges they face in the 21st century. Tonight, it is my great pleasure to welcome one of our own local experts, Dr. David Michener, who is Associate Curator at the University of Michigan Mathai Botanical Gardens and Nichols Arboretum, where he oversees collection development, renovation, and related information management. Dr. Michener is also and I'm going to call you David, is also a long-standing member on the university's Museum Studies Program Steering Committee, and he's a faculty associate in the program in the environment. In his many capacities here at U of M, Dr. Michener, David, has supervised a number of U of M graduate degrees. He's taught courses on such topics as plant materials and design and conservation issues in zoos, aquaria, and botanical gardens. And on top of these many jobs, he also teaches in the Michigan Math and Science Scholars Annual Summer Program. David Michener earned his undergraduate degree in botany with highest honors from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and he earned a doctorate in botany from the Claremont Graduate School and Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden. He came to us in 1990 after working for several years at the Arnold Arboretum of Harvard University. He is the author of a number of articles in academic publications, and in the popular press is the co-author of Taylor's Guide to Ground Covers with Nan Sinton. He is an avid plantsman, as he defines himself, and he credits all of his grandparents who were avid gardeners in southern Kansas for influencing him greatly in his love of plants. One of his current research emphases, or dare I say passions, involves tracing the origins and relationships of Peony lactiflora, otherwise known as the common garden peony. And he's tracing their origins using DNA evidence. David first saw wild peonies in the Russian Far East in the 1990s while working on a very different project. And he tells us he's been in denial ever since of having caught the peony bug. And I think tonight we will see him publicly overcome that denial. In his presentation tonight, Dr. Michener will discuss how museum practices have framed the stewardship and decision-making at the Nichols Arboretum and at the Mathai Botanical Garden as the institution has shaped its collection and become an international leader in living collection management, particularly related to the Arboretum's historical Peony Garden. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our friend and colleague, Dr. David Michener.
I think that made me go live on this. Thank you for such a warm introduction, and it is an honor and a pleasure to be here tonight. I hadn't really thought about being in denial of the peony bug, but I think I am going to have to publicly acknowledge that at least I've got it a little bit. The Peony Garden is a beloved place and institution here in Ann Arbor. And I hope by the end of this evening, you're convinced it's also one of the great university-related museum collections here at the University of Michigan. But I thought I'd start off with just asking a set of questions about peonies. And I'm going to drive them down, and then I'm going to put them in a context of how this works with a museum. There's a parallel set of thoughts about the Peony Garden as well. But for our time restraints, I'm going to focus it on the peonies as a train of thought. I think when you listen to people season after season in the Peony Garden, many of them think of it as a flower, maybe as a plant, and they don't give it much more thought. Although I have had people come through at about this time of year and ask where they are. So this idea of some seasonality and ephemerality hasn't really resonated with some people. There's some deeper issues when we think about it as an object or as in a museum context. And some of these attributes are tangible that relate to their identity. We can think of these, and it's a fascinating way to think of them, as a commodity on a market of ornamental plants, that they have varying values across time as tastes change. As a result, much like other forms of art, certain ones can become prized possessions of collectors, and they also at that point can become historical artifacts, whether collectors continue to like them or not. Strangely, they can also be reference specimens, because unlike other forms of art, they're easily replicated where all the daughter units are as authentic as the original, because we're talking about clones. So that's one way of thinking about it. There's a whole other set of intangibles that come in thinking about peony gardens and museums and how we deal with them. Some of these plants become cultural icons. They stand as visual reference pieces in aesthetic history. And as a result, they have projected on them, or people attribute to them, various values of beauty, of meaning, of significance, and we see this in a number of different cultures. To help along with this, one of the things I've done with almost all the pictures is given you the name of this particular peony and the year that it's introduced, as well as the breeder who created it for a market at a time. So these are some of the issues. So when you go out into the Peony Garden in most of the academic year, this is what you see, which as far as a university gallery for students and faculty is pretty disappointing, isn't it? It looks like we ought to be having huge chess pieces out on it or something and get art students to move them around. So how is this a museum, and why do we care? And that's where I want to launch you into today. For most people coming into the garden, I think it's that source of pleasure, source of beauty. Somehow children, like cats, seem to know how to color coordinate with the flowers in the background. And I just am totally amused at this in the world. But isn't that just the whole sense of revelry and enjoying it and just immersing yourself in beauty? Certainly the Peony Garden here as a local cultural icon is a place where we go and see. Shakespeare in the Arb each year uses it either as an entrance or an exit to the performance, sometimes even incorporating it into the scene. So there's this whole sense of the possibility of having pageantry separate from a museum collection that I think is important to acknowledge. But we need to recognize we don't hold a candle in the Midwest to the great peony pageant that happens every year, usually the same day as our Peony Fest, and has been going on since the 1930s. The town of Van Wert, Ohio, about 2 hours drive from here, used to be the center of commercial production of peonies for the cut flower trade. And they celebrate with a Queen Jubilee Festival every year, and it continues to the present. But I just thought the 2011 Queen's Court was just so not U of M for how we would present peonies, and so wonderful for how American culture just celebrates peonies. All this is about peonies, specifically Jubilee. And I believe that we are one of the few public gardens that actually has the Jubilee peony that was introduced in Van Wert, Ohio. And I've been through their entire website, and I have yet to find a person in the peony parade with the Jubilee parade. It may be they don't even have it anymore. So I find this as an interesting element to introduce, celebrating peonies and then rerouting back to the peonies, back to the exact precise one, can diverge or unite or have interesting social lives. There are 4 ways I want us to think about tonight. And these are peonies as museum objects in a museum setting. Not only are these postilions beautiful, but they represent something as cultural heritage. As we work through these peonies, we're also making these the international reference standards, as you will see, so that there's no doubt that this is postilion, and if somebody else says they have it and it doesn't match precisely, we're right. This is the reference collection. That's what we're building to. Related to this, we don't have room for all the peonies we would like. There are over 20,000 have been introduced in the last 150 years of European and North American breeding. We have room for fewer than 400 pairs of plants. So we have to select well what's going in this museum collection. And we're also rejuvenating the collection for a particular date, June 5th in 2022, as you'll see in a little bit. As we work through these issues, it really helps us engage the academic community and students with thinking about these as museum objects in a museum context and a living museum, even if most of the year, most kids would rather get students would rather use Frisbees on the Peony Garden. This garden was founded as a collection to show exemplary peonies. It starts in 1922 with a vision, and it opens to the public 5 years later. Shortly after opening, we have these wonderful period photographs. This is the Peony Garden. The genesis is from Dr. W.E. Upjohn, U of M class of 1875. He was a physician, and in his life, he became fascinated with flowers. Irises came first, then he became totally enamored of peonies, and he became one of the great collectors of peonies in North America. His own estate in Brook Lodge, he grew over 600 varieties, excuse me, and of those 600, he was constantly evaluating them. He had apparently cumulatively over 800 different cultivars, different kinds, because he would slowly reject the ones he didn't like. He opened his garden to the public during the peak bloom so that all people could see the beauty of peonies. He realized that there needed to be some way of continuing this collection and this activity, and in 1922, he worked with the university, and the Regents appropriated $2,000 to build the peony collection, and Dr. Upjohn worked with leading growers to assemble the plants you see here. Much the same view you can see today, yes? So it's been a very stable collection in some ways, and one we all love, this being the view from Laurel Ridge, for those of you who know the gardens. So one of the things that makes it interesting as a peony collection is there's an intent, and I argue that all museum collections have an intent. And the intent here, and it was published, was, and you can read it there, those varieties of established merit. Where are the bronze tablets that tell me what established merit is? It might have been clear in 1922 to 27 which plants had established merit, but the garden wasn't filled. There's room for more, but it's a finite space. And unlike an art gallery, we can't just put them in, put them up for an exhibit, and take them out. it takes the better part of 5 years for a peony plant to get to blooming size to be the way it should be. So we're not just rearranging this willy-nilly. There were the 280 cultivars that were deemed to be those of established merit, which is more than well over half of the site. And in the plans, there's a space for tree peonies. But we all know what happened after 1927. The Great Depression hit soon thereafter, changing circumstances, and the Peony Garden was not significantly expanded for its holdings. The designer was Dr. Tialdi, the director of the Peony Garden, the director of the Arboretum at that point, and on the faculty here in landscape design. He designed a wonderful garden, and I view it as wonderful, very modern in its sense of, rather than being a Beaux-Arts influenced or some such, it's very geometric. The plants were always in twos, that a double, a double, a double, and the dots indicate that the spaces were empty. So there was room for some expansion, and there was also clearly a sense of the plants were to be evaluated. So there was an intent. When we do what is called gap analysis, we look at the collection that we have now, and we try to analyze it by several different ways. And I'm calling the way it was as of 3 years ago, inherited. If we look at the date when this particular cultivar was introduced, we find a very small amount from the very first introductions of ornamental peonies from Asia to Europe and North America. They came in the late 1700s to the 1820s. We have very few, but we do have some representation there. This pie chart is by 25-year blocks, just to give you a sense of it. And you can see that almost half is early 20th century. We have unknown because either the plant is unknown or because the literature does not tell us when it was introduced. It's a deduction of introduced before. And we don't know how long the before was for those. So we have to resolve those out. Where we want to go with this as a collection with an intent is, one, drive the unknowns way down. And second, for reasons that will become highlighted, we want to increase the early years, but not at the expense of this wedge here. Currently, the oldest plant we have is Agelus superba, introduced by a French breeder named Lemon in 1824. And we have right up to our 1950 break, which is what we use now. We don't collect more recently than 1950 of work by an American breeder, which are considered by many to be exemplars of the mid-20th century work of peony breeders. We use 1950 because there's a major cultural shift in why peonies were grown and why peonies were studied. And fundamentally, it's a shift from a cut flower production to peonies as landscape plants for a rising middle class who are growing them out of doors. It's an enormous shift in the aesthetics and the structure of the plants that go with it. When we look at where the peonies came from as what I will call inherited in the collection, we see that annoying unknown percentage. Japan is at 1%. Japan, China, and Korea are the original source of these cultivars. We have almost half from the US. Canada shows at 0. You have to have 4 plants in this pie chart before it automatically lets me put 1 down there. So we probably have 2 from a Canadian breeder, and heavily into French cultivars. And that's part of our inherited focus. Where we'd like to be going is to increase the North American representation to over half of the collection, emphasis on breeders of the Great Lakes region who did exemplary materials, and to significantly expand the collection in terms of peonies from Japan, China, and Korea of the same time period. This way we are able to show across cultures who's influencing whom, how, and why. And just to give you a little bit of a show of some of the changes of what's happening, this is Callot's Duke of Wellington. It shows up in both English and French, but Duc de Wellington would be the way it's officially listed in the international registries, 1859. And I just have to ask, why is a French horticulturalist honoring the Duke of Wellington, Napoleon's nemesis? There's a story here, and the very center of it is red. So what's going on with this particular cultivar? I'd love to know, and this is one of the reasons why nobody has it in the trade. As far as we know, no other garden has it. How could you possibly be rid of something like this? There's just too much fun with it. It's one of those, is this some cosmic joke going on here, and we haven't been clued in on it? This was an unknown plant for us until our International Advisory Board arrived, and one of them walked up and says, "That's Sylvia Saunders." It's almost as if he was speaking of someone he had dated in high school. I haven't seen her in years. And we had to say, well, it's an unknown. He goes, no, that's Sylvia. And he just started rattling off every characteristic of it. This is, in some ways, our most valuable plant. We have two. Just this week, we divided it and sent living pieces of roots off to Winterthur Gardens in Delaware, because Sylvia Saunders worked with her father, Dr. Saunders, for establishing Mr. DuPont's Peony Garden. And they have been missing Sylvia Saunders since 1966. And it's one of the greatest museums of material culture. You can imagine how pleased they were to have it sent. It should have arrived today. So Sylvia is a great plant, and it just shows you some of the spectrum of the diversity we're looking at. When we look at the breeders, and this is alphabetical by name rather than country, Allison over to Wilkes, and that annoying and rather stable 10 to 12% of unknown there, these are how many of, what percent of our collection we have of these breeders. So we're really heavy on an American name brand. The number of French ones, Callot, Cruz, Désert, Lemoyne, all start showing up, as well as some minor French breeders. And one of the things that becomes very striking to me about this is it's clearly the inherited collection was emphasizing something about an aesthetic range and excellence, rather than, say, half the collection being by, say, Brand, Lemoyne, and Désert. The original assembly by Dr. Upjohn and his colleagues had some standard that we can deduce. Where we want to go as we focus the collection and build on it is to better represent the North American breeders, particularly from the Midwest, where so much work was done. And that's one indication that Van Wert, Ohio has a parade. It's honoring a heritage that's so fundamental to the town's identity, even though there hasn't been a peony grower there since the Second World War. It's that fundamental. And to do that, we're going to need to bring in more to increase some of these from very low levels to slightly more without losing the original diversity that we have. So I hope some of this has convinced you that you can view these as museum objects with an intellectual history tied into social history as well, that these specimens can be reference specimens and set international standards for identity. And we've been working very hard on that. One of the first things our director, Bob Gracie, asked was, are the peonies even correctly identified? Because as a peony garden, it doesn't really matter if you just want to have an event. Yes, they can just be peonies. If we're now going to reframe the context of this garden as a museum, we have to have unquestioned authenticity. To do that, we have brought in, over a period of years, an international advisory board of peony growers, the International Registrar of Peonies, that is someone who's supposed to be tracking all of them, and he really has for 30-some years. And we had them on site with our record, specimen by specimen, to work through and say, is it or isn't it? And one of the things they're doing with us year after year with this is we're doing what we call confidence classes. Having someone walk up and say, that's Sylvia, I know her, that's confident. Working through some of these where nobody has ever seen another one of these specimens, even though they're some of the world's leading peony experts and growers, and going, I remember one of the persons saying, I recall my father saying he didn't like that. The man is in his 70s, so how many decades ago was it his father got rid of it, which is the last time he's seen it? So we have to go back to published descriptions, but these were not described for the scientific literature. They were described for the commercial market. And so the descriptors used aren't necessarily sufficient to differentiate. So one of the things we're able to do is say it fits the description, but we have to also admit the description's pretty loose. So we have confidence levels of, is it right on with no question? Going from this, and I'm honored to have in the audience a colleague, Dr. Nastasia Vlasova from the Academy of Sciences of Belarus, working on what's called DNA certification of cultivars. That is, can we fingerprint these? And she's working on the methods and the target systems to go, can we differentiate one clone from another, from another, from another, so that there's no ambiguity in the future as we have these plants or anything happens to their records, that this one is the one that was seen by the international group on that in our generation, and we've vetted it, and now we've got it fingerprinted. And this will become important as we talk about sending clones to other institutions, because if we have it DNA fingerprinted, they can lose the records, and we can reconstruct it decades hence of what do we have. This is why it's so important. And you can tell Nastasia's a fun person to work with. So that's setting some standard of excellence in terms of the collection. But one of the things that comes with this is if we have room for expansion, and some of that is within it, it was never totally filled, and some of the plants may or may not fit the highest standards of excellence, because that was our founding vision, yes? That these are plants of recognized merit. As I say, how do I know what's meritorious? As the curator, I think it would be extremely arrogant for me to come in and basically say, I like that one, I like that one, and I like that one. But that's within the purview of a curator's role. That's not professionally responsible. For this, we need advisors who can bring us different perspectives, some counsel of the years, and some tempering to my occasional dislike of particular peonies and perhaps over-rapturous affection for others. See, Carla, I'm admitting, I'm catching the bug. I do have preferences. So some of the key perspectives here are those who really know the peonies, those who know garden history and design history for what was an important element or set of criteria in aesthetics of an era. And I want to walk you through some of these different issues as we establish for our collection and publish it of what are the criteria of excellence. And I've divided it into three main areas for you to think about. One of them is legacy, which I'm going to call the history. It's the inherited one, and we'll walk through this. Another one is conservation, because if this is a living reference collection, it's something we're trying to carry for generations to come. And so the criteria of excellence within that. And another one is the social history, the cultural history. For some of these plants only in the originating culture, but some of that is European or American, or the exchange between Asia and Euro-American horticulture and interest. So I want to walk you through a couple of these. By legacy, what we're coming up with in terms of just some basic standards, and then we'll refine them, is was it in the original gift from Dr. Upjohn, whether they were his plants or one he also assembled. We have to go by the inventory for that, and Dr. Upjohn published a booklet of his favorite peonies and his rankings of them out at Brook Lodge, and the overlap is phenomenal. We also had with that, was there a subsequent wave of acquisitions that met what we can deduce of his founding intent and spirit, which we have to write down, we have to codify, and then come up with the criteria for how does it meet. And then there's the overall issue of design integrity. The garden is a historic design commission, and we are preserving it. That's why we're not expanding the peony beds to hold more peonies. That would destroy the 1922 design. So we're holding it stable within that. And let me just show you a couple. Dr. Upjohn loved to do relative ranking, what we might call crowdsourcing. He worked with American Peony Society and took one of their systems, and he would have his guests come and look at his peonies and score them. And he had a scoring sheet, and so it went from 1 to 10. It was decimal. This is the Swan Lucine. It's one of the French introductions of the early 20th century. And out of his 157 favorite plants, he agreed with his crowdsourcing friends. They ranked it 9.9 out of 10. And anything under 7 is considered not worth looking at, by the way. And so he has his own notes about these. And so he had his idea, which we're trying to deduce of what's beautiful. He tested with surveys. Doesn't it sound like a good U of M alum? He's really working this almost as an experiment. And then he published his connoisseur's opinions of these, and he calls this, I believe, an unrivaled exemplar in so many words, and gives it no flaws. Others, he definitely is willing to talk about the flaws because he's giving you his judgment and the reasons for it. By the 1930s, this became no longer followed. I think part of it was changing aesthetics. It may be that Dr. Upjohn has published his works, but when we look at Dr. Upjohn's standards, we know that the 280 plants in the original gift that he helped assemble, some from his own garden, must have met a fundamental test by him of they passed. So from that, we're trying to deduce what met the standards. In the founding spirit, this is Red Goddess from the 1940s by an American breeder, where you are wanting plants that are of unquestioned authenticity. That is not a Fitz description, but it really is. Then that's what I mean by authentic. The peer literature and judging comments have to indicate that it's one of the best by the contemporary standards because these are judged in contemporary culture. And we've decided to follow with Dr. Upjohn's intent of we're looking for the best, not for having, say, who was the most prolific American or Canadian breeder. So that's why I call it major to obscure artist, and go for the entire range of what was presented, whether or not it was commercially successful, because the market follows what's commercially successful. So another criterion of excellent set we have to come up with, and we're going to rank all of these against each other, it's a fun project, is we need to be thinking of it for our best that they really are genetic specimens, and it's the genetic heritage of an era that we're preserving, and we need to figure out how to preserve here and elsewhere. We are having a garden with a design history, and one of the elements that's entirely missing that we have to bring in is some of the representatives of the wild species, many of which are from environments in danger in Asia, from overdevelopment, to show what was the source of diversity from nature in terms of how did humans work with it. When we look at some of this as reference materials in terms of genetically, what is it? This is the peony that parade's about. This is Jubilee in our garden, and it was significant enough that the American Peony Society show in 1960 made the New York Times just for this plant, and that Mrs. Please was aged 90. When you read through the entire article, it turns out she didn't even start breeding peonies until she retired. She didn't even start until her late 50s to early 60s, depending which one. Again, a phenomenal social history, but what's important is we have no doubt that this is Jubilee as a genotype to preserve. And by the way, Dr. Upjohn's group gave this, I believe, an 8.6 to an 8.9 for the range, and he critiques it for, although it's magnificent, the stems are of insufficient strength. So we're having a connoisseur say beautiful in essence, but could be better. Don't we love it? We absolutely love it. Conservation and these unknowns. Remember I said that Sylvia Saunders was unknown to us? So at one level, I'd just like to throw out all the unknowns in terms of who knows what it is. At another level, we know that they were once known. And our advisors have looked at, I believe, all but 3, and they all agree that it's not any of the things that were in the spot that had that name. So we know that they aren't what was growing there, and we don't know what it is anymore. So what do you do with them? I have this. This is just a form range, as it's called, of semi-doubles to doubles. I could make this a complete spectrum for both texture and color using known cultivars. So if I have an unknown cultivar that's in the semi to semi-double range of a pinkish hue, Does it have any value? Morphologically, it may not, but it may for cultural background, for who was the breeder. These are some judgments we have to come up. And one of the things we have to articulate, and I want it written and in the literature, is how we're making these decisions so that decades hence people can look back and evaluate and critique what we've done. And one of the things I'm actually thinking about with this is when it comes time to make some incremental decisions on this, maybe we're going to crowdsource part of it. Get people's opinion in public. You know, if to me they're equally undesirable or equally mid-grade, I'll triage it. Maybe we should look at what Dr. Upjohn did, and maybe we'll have 6,660 rather than 66 people voting on it. It'll be fun. Yes? Related to this, if we're going to be a conservation center, we have to replicate material and send it to other gardens. We are the founding institution of a North American peony collaborative with the Scott Arboretum, working with tree peonies. We're taking this in the next year and to build a North American-wide network of peony gardens. We're working with international collaborators, as Dr. Vlasova. So we've built the website so you can take it into any language immediately through Google Translate and see everything we're doing in the database and the records we're working with in a language that you prefer to look at. So this is all about us and the Scott Arboretum in Belarusian. We've had a number of people comment how much they like it because they don't have to read it in English. Another set of criteria of excellence has to come up in terms of social culture, of what's relevant to it. And so I've based it in terms of what I'll call geographic impact. Is there a local history? Is there a regional social history that goes with it? And then is there a broader impact from Asia to North America and Europe? And these are three areas where we have to come up with the criteria rather than just my opinions. So one of them that we start off with is the gift from Dr. Upjohn. That's clearly of at least regional significance as holding an aesthetic set that someone thought was worth collecting and worth having people admire, look at, study, think about. The documentation for these is one we're working with very much. Right now we know that we have 130 of his 157 favorite plants and his comments about it. And for example, Duchess de Nemours gets a reasonable vote out of him. And what I like about it is with his comments, we get a sense of who Dr. Upjohn was and his sense of humor. Some of you may not know what Prohibition was, but it was commonly called Dry America because everybody was supposed to be dry. And he makes the comment here that others have found it to be, quote, most intoxicating for fragrance. He thinks, in essence, that will compensate for some of its virtues because it will amuse all of those who are lacking a good drink. I just think it's hysterical dry humor. It is throughout his descriptions. There's clearly a social history here. We have a local note that goes with it. This particular peony, which when I first saw it, I thought was, I will call it a dog. That was my own eye for it. I didn't think it was attractive, but it was here. And it called itself Andrew Mulig. For those of us in Ann Arbor, there's Mulig Funeral Home. That just looks a little bit too close. Our director, Bob Gracie, ran across a reference by Grace Schachman. It turns out Mr. Weinberg had introduced a Andrew Mulig in the 1920s. And in the international registries, we have this name coming up on a quote, Mr. Alexander's list. I've spoken with the international registrar. Mr. Alexander's list has other typos in it, and we both think this is Andrew Mulig. There may be one nursery that has it in its own non-commercial stock, just as a reference. That's a maybe. Otherwise, the one plant in one of the beds is the only one remaining. Had it been me 2 years ago, I would have said, why do we have it? Now that we are able to put it in terms of some greater context of the social history of a museum collection and how it was assembled, this is so valuable to have because it's a view into a window of local history. One of the things that also comes up is we're trying to get people to look at the plants and think about them in other ways. Many of these carry the names of women. Why were women being honored? Who are these women? Many of them most people haven't heard of because they're European women, but not just Europeans. Likewise, for those particularly from France and the lowlands coming here and seeing the peony names, they don't recognize the names of the American women on them. So I just want to give you an example of how this works. And these are the self-guided tours we put out for the public so that they can find some of these plants. There's scores of them, some of them quite something. I was surprised to find that a number of people under what I would say the visible age of 30 had no idea of who Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt was. The First Lady of the United States at a critical period of our history, and it's still an extremely popular peony, but there she is. By contrast, nobody has known who Fanny Crosby is. I was clueless, and this required some work by our staff who helped me understand that she was a Protestant hymn and writer, that she wrote several hundred hymns that were quite popular in the late 1800s and early 1900s. She was blind since childhood, and she had a very real sense of right and wrong, which comes across out of one of Mr. Upjohn's comments about her. So there she is. As one person says, you wouldn't dare sing her hymns off key, would you, looking at that picture? All of these people must have had personalities. These aren't just names. They're not just paint colors. They're part of our cultural history. I don't think anybody really grows Fanny Crosby anymore. Of course we're going to have these. We want the social histories for all of these and the criteria to evaluate what makes it important at what level, because we have to judge. There's another issue with culture here, and that is the plants moving from Asia to North America and Europe and vice versa. Some of you are probably aware that peonies were valued in the European medicinal traditions going back to Galen and before, that is for over 2 millennia. But the European peonies are not ornamentals in the sense that we view them. The moment the Asian materials came in the late 1700s, they completely supplant the European genotypes in terms of ornamentality. They have different forms, they're more colors, they're more robust, they grow well. So although there's a knowledge of peonies in the Western tradition, it's not really as an ornamental, it's a medicinal. These arrive, and to give you one example, we have the term of something called Japanese peonies show up. Well, in part this is a term because the term Japanese specifically means those peonies that have broad anthers in the middle, but it also can refer to plants from Japan in other contexts. And so there's confusion about, is this, quote, Japanese peony really from a Japanese source, or is it an American breeder building a particular form? What's going on here? Am I making sense that we're having this, the source and an aesthetic are being confounded in the literature? And then you get strange things like this, the center of a peony flower, that are clearly derived from something like a Japanese form. Where are they coming from? Where's the aesthetic coming for this? We have to figure it out. This becomes a real issue with the tree peonies, which we're beginning to add, which you'll see shortly. We've acquired this one. And in the Japanese literature, it's kinkaku, or however that should be properly pronounced. In the Western literature, it is this Souvenir du Professeur Maxime Cornu, introduced by a breeder named Hendry in 1907. Will the real source stand up? Only one person or one group could have introduced it, and in the same time window, it shows up almost immediately in both. Which is the authentic identity and which is the cultural heritage it's coming from? Intriguingly, this issue of authenticity comes up in the museum world in decorative arts, and there's a published literature on it, of authenticity in Oriental rugs. Who knew the curator of living plants would be looking at the literature of Oriental rug authenticity, looking for ideas of how do you determine which is the originating influence and which is the related influenced object. This is a really good example of it, and it turns out there will be several. Related to this, as a museum collection is coming back to that we want to have the original vision and the original intent, which was to show tree peonies as well, in order to show the diversity and the story of peonies in nature and across cultures. That seems to be pretty clear the thrust of where Dr. Upjohn was going with his looking for the best and a wide range of kinds of peonies, and that tree peonies were listed as on the map, but never planted. For those of you familiar with the Arb, this is the entrance near the hospital. These are the peony beds. The tree peonies were to go under the conifers that stretch all the way along here, adjacent to what is now the Post collection of rhododendrons and azaleas. This site can hold the better part of 60 or more tree peonies. Our director, Bob Gracie, has come up with a rejuvenation plan where we're putting the tree peonies at the edge, but we're arranging them Japanese and Korean here, Chinese here, European and North American selections over here, room for others in here, and the main beds of herbaceous peonies, we're going to start pulling some to themes, and on the side we're going to put in Chinese herbaceous peonies up to 1950, Japanese varieties up to 1950, and Korean varieties. And this gets into very interesting acquisition issues, by the way, because in most of the Asian cultures, the tree peonies are much more valued than the herbaceous ones. And so the aesthetic value in literature goes with the tree peonies, not with these, and in fact, finding them is a bit of a challenge. We know they exist from the cultural literature. One of the beds that's just been recently added, and in fact the garden had to be modified a bit to hold it, are the Chinese tree peonies pre-1950. Our cutoff date works well, it turns out, with the Communist Revolution and Mao's change of government in 1949. And so we're putting in these beds, focusing on the 4 cultures that have been involved in the aesthetics of tree peonies. And by the way, all the wild forms are in Asia. There are no European forms of tree peonies in the wild. And so this is a particular concern for us to be able to show the conservation messages that go with them and the source of all this ornamental diversity. There are forms and colors we don't see in contemporary European culture. We have worked on these to bring in authentic plants from Chinese suppliers and Japanese suppliers. We're not going through middlemen. We've worked out the import issues, and we've worked with some of the faculty here in Asian Studies for which ones have some cultural meaning to the name so that there's a story, not just us going, well, that's a pretty orange or that's a pretty pink. We're looking for those. And so Zhao's Fen, this is some kind of powder, and it gets into the whole issue of cosmetics of court ladies and what powders they would be wearing. What a strange color. Yes, I want to see it myself. For the Japanese ones, we've been working with, in large part, on size, form, and color, because those turned out to be meaningful and often in a narrower range of colors than the Chinese varieties. These plants are all here in town right now. We won't plant them out for a year. We keep them under observation before putting them out. So we're having fun with different looks, and all of these fitting our criteria this way. For the herbaceous peonies, as we're looking to expand it, we're hitting some really weird things that most of us had never seen before. We don't really have a peony that looks like this. So the source cultures are having different forms and selections than what happened in the West. Who's really surprised by that? But it's exciting. But what it also brings back to, if you think about our very early plants, the 1824 one I showed you, it's fairly well developed. It doesn't look like a wild form. Is it just a Japanese or Chinese herbaceous peony that was given the name Edgeless superba by Lemoyne in 1824 to sell it? This is part of what the DNA fingerprinting will help us with as well. So going to another element of museums and how we think of this in museums, and I'll just fly you through, we want complete and universal access to this collection, including the intellectual knowledge with it. For that, we've been building a website with help from a federal agency and our donors so that when you're out there, you can walk through. There are grid maps that you can work with so that when you're there, you can be in a particular bed, you can know where you are, by what rows over what columns, and in season, you can then write it down and go look up on our website. What we're working for as another iteration of it is that the plants are about 1 meter apart, and GPS in your cell phone is getting good enough. We want a subsequent iteration to give this to you so that when you're next to the peonies, it's giving you the options of which ones it is so that it can take you straight to this so that you're finding out the information that we want to convey to you. And again, you can kick it into any language Google operates in so that you can read it for yourself at your convenience with it. We also have a search in there so that if you have keys, words to it, we're working with the metadata to make this work. And we have the intent of having an image search that works in various ways. And by this spring, we'll have over 2,000 pictures in it to our vetted materials. You can drive down deeper, come up with all kinds of great information that we've vetted with the International Registrar, Mr. Rainer Jakubowski. And if you're interested in other elements, you can come up with the history of it, other sites. We're trying to build it as a place where you can come and find out information about it without having to come to us, and to link it to the literature that goes with it. The whole thing is to work on various different platforms of smartphones to drive it down so that you can come in and find out what you need, when and how you do this. The whole grand summation of all of this is, as a museum, rather than just a display garden, we can engage inquiring minds of faculty and students. Some of you may recall a year ago, we had Dr. Roz Hammers talk about the tree peonies and Song Dynasty art. If you missed it, the link is on our website. It's a 78-minute and it's wonderful. But these criteria that we have let us link to the university in intellectual ways. We have or continue to work with students and faculty in every one of these departments of U of M or sister institutions to work on specific questions that we have. And one of the ones, for example, right now with Europe, I'm working with an undergraduate to come up with a model of valuation of peonies based on different criteria, whether they're museum objects, commodities, and we're working with the literature for what's the method of giving value so that we can rank it and compare it, because we are working across different kinds of ways of thinking about what is a peony garden, what makes it work. With community collaborators, we're able now to take other groups within the university and to be a portal to their unit using our collections and ways to have collaborative programming. And all of it is to come together in a few years on June 5th, 2022. Two things happen on that date. One, it's Dr. Upjohn's 169th birthday. He loved peonies in part because they bloomed on his birthday. That season is our centennial. So the rejuvenation plan needs to be done by the centennial. To help put a little bit of pressure and to make it happen, we've already approached the American Peony Society, and we will be the site host of their annual meeting. So we'll be able to show it off. There's nothing like having company come to get everything done. We all know this one. One of the things we'll be featuring, both here and in other contexts, is some of the research and the student and faculty work from our international collaborations, where you see the roots of it coming already, of putting this reference collection in context. The rejuvenation plan will be done, and we will have found every one of Dr. Upjohn's favorite 157 peonies, or we will know that it is nowhere on the face of the earth. That makes some sense about it? This is called We Are Going to Party About It. And so we have a special thanks because this has been done almost entirely with the support of private donors and some funding agencies. I've been requested and encouraged to read you something. It's the only part that I'm going to read you tonight, and it is a statement from the second person listed, Martha Parfit. Tomorrow, the University's Central Development Office will be issuing a press release through all of its organs. And this is a section of it that I think is just so exciting, and I can't memorize it given the excitement about it. A gift from the granddaughter of Michigan alumnus Dr. William E. Upjohn to Mathey Botanical Gardens and Nichols Arboretum will help restore and protect the largest collection of heirloom peonies in North America. The gift honors Dr. Upjohn and establishes the W.E. Upjohn Peony Garden Fund to care for the historically and internationally significant Nichols Arboretum Peony Garden. The $500,000 gift from Martha G. Parfit, the last living grandchild of W.E. Upjohn, is the largest endowment gift in the history of the Botanical Gardens and Arboretum. The support of the Upjohn family runs deep at the University of Michigan, and the Peony Garden gift is part of that long-standing affiliation. Dr. Upjohn and 5 of his siblings earned degrees from the University of Michigan in medicine and pharmacy between 1871 and 1886. That began a nearly 150-year connection between the university and has included degrees and gifts across the university. Martha Parfit notes, Amelia and Mary Upjohn, who earned their degrees in pharmacy in 1871, were among the first 4 women graduates of any unit of this university. She adds that much like her own family's connection to Michigan, the Nichols Arboretum Peony Garden combines a link to the past with a strong mission of preservation for generations to come. We are honored that the university has cared for the peony collection for more than 90 years. Peonies were one of my grandfather's great passions, and he would be so pleased to see how the plants from the original collection are still growing and will continue to thrive in the Nichols Arboretum. So with a great thanks to all of our supporters, to the gift that's being announced tomorrow by Martha Parfit, I thank you, and I appreciate your attendance here this evening.